The warship was enormous. It moved through the dark of space the way a storm moves across an open field, slow, heavy, and absolutely sure of itself. The HFY had built it over 30 years and had named it after their greatest emperor. Every hallway inside it was wide enough for 4 of their kind to walk side by side. Every wall was plated in dark iron. Every light burned a cold, pale blue. Emperor Drathon stood at the front of the ship and looked out at the stars. He was a tall creature, broad at the shoulders, with grey-green skin that looked like old stone under the lights. His eyes were gold, and they had the kind of stillness in them that came from never once being told no. He had ruled the HFY Empire for 20 years. Before him, his father had ruled for 30. The Empire had not lost a war in 400 years. Drathon saw no reason that would ever change. Behind him, his daughter stood quietly. Princess Sevala was younger than she looked and older than she acted, depending on the day. She had her father's gold eyes and her mother's sharp mind. She had grown up on stories of conquest, of new worlds folded into the Empire, of species that fought back and lost, of the long, proud march of HFY history across the galaxy. She had always listened to those stories with great interest. She had never once questioned them. Today was a processing day. That was what they called it. When a new species was brought into the Empire, their warriors were separated, catalogued, tested. It was efficient. It was orderly. It was the HFY way. The humans had been collected from their planet 3 weeks ago. There were 41 of them in the lower holds, behind iron doors and thick glass. Most of them had been wounded during the initial capture. A few had not made it through the first week. The ones that remained were kept fed and warded, because damaged goods had less value at assignment time. Sevala was not supposed to go to the lower holds. Her father had told her to remain in the upper quarters, to review diplomatic texts, to prepare for the formal proceedings the following morning. She had nodded and said yes, of course, and had gone directly to the lower holds as soon as he turned away. She told herself she was just curious. That was all. She was a princess and a scholar, and she had read everything the Empire's researchers had written about humans in the past 6 months, which was not very much. They were a young species. Small planet. Limited reach beyond their own solar system. The researchers had described them as moderately intelligent, emotionally volatile, and physically unremarkable. One report had used the word fragile. She wanted to see for herself. The guards at the entrance to the holds let her through without argument, because she was the Emperor's daughter and none of them wanted to be the one who turned her away. She walked slowly down the long corridor, her boots quiet on the metal floor, the pale blue lights casting strange shadows across the iron doors. Most of the prisoners were asleep, or sitting with their backs against the walls, or lying on their sides looking at nothing. A few looked up when she passed. Their eyes were different colors: brown, blue, green, grey. She had read about that. It still surprised her to see it. Among the HFY, all eyes were gold. She found the variation strange and a little unsettling, like something that should have been uniform but wasn't. She was almost at the end of the corridor when she stopped. In the last cell on the left, a human male was sitting on the floor in the exact center of the space, cross-legged, completely still. His hands rested on his knees. His back was straight. His eyes were open and he was looking up at the ceiling. He was not particularly large. He was not the biggest human she had seen in the holds. His clothes were torn at the shoulder and there was a long-heeled cut across his left jaw, pale against his brown skin. He looked, at first glance, completely ordinary. She stopped and looked at him through the glass. For a moment he didn't move. Then, slowly, as if he had known she was there all along and had simply chosen to finish what he was doing first, he lowered his eyes from the ceiling and looked directly at her. She had expected fear. Every other prisoner who had noticed her had shown some version of it: a flinch, a shrinking back, a look that was either hostile or desperate, both of which were understandable. Fear was normal. Fear was expected. Fear was what the Empire counted on. This man did not look afraid. He did not look angry either. He did not look desperate or sad or broken. He just looked at her. His eyes were dark brown and they were very, very calm. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they already know the answer to and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then he looked back up at the ceiling. She realized she had stopped breathing. She stood there for another moment, not sure what to do, which was not a feeling she had often. Then she turned and walked back down the corridor and up the stairs and said nothing to anyone. That night she sat in her quarters with her books open in front of her and did not read a single page. She kept thinking about his eyes. She had been told the humans were fragile. She had read the word herself, in the report, in clean official type. Fragile. And most of them did seem fragile, exhausted and hurt and small inside their iron cages. But that one had not looked fragile. He had looked like a man sitting inside a cage that he had already decided was temporary. She pulled the research file on the human prisoners and found his name. Cole Harden. Age 31. Rank, Staff Sergeant, United Earth Defense Corps. Combat deployments, 7. Commendations, 4. The file noted that he had been found at the rear of a defensive position during the initial capture, organizing the retreat of injured soldiers. It noted that he had to be restrained by 3 Vethkai soldiers because he refused to stop moving toward the injured until he had physically accounted for each one. It also noted that he had been calm during the restraint. She read that word twice. Calm. She closed the file and sat in the dark for a while. Down in the lower holds, Cole Harden sat in his cell and looked at the ceiling. He had counted 214 rivets so far. He was mapping the layout of the ship from the sounds he could hear through the walls, the hum of engines, the movement of personnel, the rhythm of guard rotations. He was learning the language from the fragments he heard through the vents, slowly and carefully, the way he learned everything. He had noticed the girl watching him. He had noticed the way she had stopped breathing. He went back to counting rivets and thought about a great many things, and none of them were small. The arena was on the 4th deck. It was not really an arena in the way one might imagine. There were no seats for crowds, no decorations on the walls, no sense that anyone was meant to enjoy what happened there. It was a large, open room with metal floors and high ceilings, full of cargo crates, old equipment, broken machinery, and various objects that had been left there over the years for exactly this kind of occasion. The Vethkai called it the proving floor. Every species they had ever conquered had walked across it. General Orith had been overseeing combat demonstrations for 11 years. He was good at his job. He had a slow, careful way of watching things, like a man who was always looking for the detail that everyone else missed. His junior officer, a younger general named Feln who was eager and loud and had not yet learned to be quiet, stood beside him on the observation deck above the floor. They had selected 6 humans for the first demonstration. 3 men, 3 women. The selection criteria was simple. They chose the ones who looked most physically capable. They were interested in combat data. How humans fought. What methods they used. Whether they had any instinct for coordination or whether they were, as the researchers suggested, primarily individual and reactive. Cole Harden was one of the 6. Beside him stood Danny Ruiz, a compact woman with short dark hair and quick, careful eyes who had been working as a combat medic before her capture and had not, at any point in her captivity, stopped thinking about how to be useful. On Cole's other side stood Owen Paz, a tall, lean man with very little expression on his face and a habit of standing in whatever corner gave him the best view of the entire room. He had been a Marine sniper. He did not talk much. He noticed everything. The other 3 humans selected were not soldiers by training. They were a supply officer, a communications technician, and an engineer. They were afraid, and their fear was visible and honest. They stood close together and looked at the room with wide eyes. General Feln had designed the demonstration. He had placed the 6 humans in the room and told them, through a translator, that they were to complete a task, retrieve a marked container from the far side of the floor and bring it back to the starting point. Simple. Clear. Between them and the container were 3 Vethkai combat drones, deactivated but made to look active, and a set of physical barriers that would take coordination and strength to move. Feln expected the humans to rush forward, panic, separate, and fail. He had seen it before with other species. They all did something similar. Cole stood at the starting line and looked at the room for a long time without moving. Feln watched from above and said, quietly, that the demonstration could begin whenever the humans were ready. The translator passed this on. Cole didn't move. He stood there for almost 2 full minutes, just looking. He turned his head slowly, taking in every corner. His eyes moved to the crates, to the ceiling, to the drone units, to the barriers. He looked at the walls. He looked at the floor. His lips moved slightly, like a man doing math in his head. Then he turned and spoke to the others in a low voice, and the translator had trouble catching all of it because he was speaking quickly and quietly and in the shorthand of people who had worked together before. But the shape of it was clear. He was assigning positions, giving each person a role, and the roles were not based on aggression. They were based on what each person already knew how to do. Danny went left. She moved low and fast along the wall, using the crates as cover, and she did not look like a woman who was scared of the drones because she had already seen that their power indicators were dark and their sensor heads were not tracking. She had looked at them the same way Cole had, for the same reasons, and reached the same answer 2 minutes earlier. Owen went right and immediately found high ground, a stack of cargo containers near the far wall that gave him sight lines across the whole floor. He did not have a weapon, but he was watching every approach, and everyone in the room, including the Vethkai above, could see that he was watching and that it was deliberate. Cole moved straight down the center. He didn't rush. He walked at a steady, unhurried pace, and the 3 non-soldiers moved with him in a tight formation because he had told them exactly where to be, and they trusted him the way people in frightening situations trust the person who sounds least frightened. The barriers in the center of the floor were heavy. 2 large metal frames bolted to a track system, designed to require at least 4 people to shift manually. Cole looked at them for a moment, then found the manual release lever on the wall beside the track. It was not hidden. It had just not been in the briefing because Feln had not thought a species encountering this room for the first time would look for it. Cole released both barriers in about 8 seconds. They reached the container. Danny was already beside it, having come around from the left. Owen had moved down from his perch and arrived at the same moment from the right. The whole thing had taken 4 minutes and 20 seconds. No one had been hurt. No one had panicked. The 3 non-soldiers were breathing hard, but they were in one piece and they were standing exactly where Cole had told them to stand. Cole picked up the container, walked back to the starting line, and set it down. Then he looked up at the observation deck and waited. The silence in the room above lasted a very long time. General Feln had his mouth open. He closed it. He opened it again and said nothing. Beside him, General Orith had his hands folded behind his back and was staring at the floor below with an expression that was not easy to read, something between professional respect and deep personal discomfort. Orith leaned toward Emperor Drathon, who had come to observe, and said in a low, even voice that perhaps, in hindsight, allowing the humans to see the layout of the ship before the demonstration had not been the wisest choice. Drathon said nothing. He was still watching Cole. Cole was still looking up at them. He was not smiling. He was not performing. He just stood there with his hands at his sides and his face still and patient and his dark eyes completely calm. At the back of the observation deck, behind a support column she was very much not supposed to be standing behind, Princess Sevalar had both hands pressed flat against the metal wall. She had come because she could not stay away. She had been telling herself all morning that what she had seen through the glass the night before was nothing, that the human was just a prisoner, that she had imagined some quality in him that was not really there. She was no longer telling herself that. She looked down at Cole Harden standing on the arena floor, relaxed and quiet in the middle of a room that was supposed to break him, and she felt something move through her that she did not have a word for yet. It was not attraction. It was not quite fear. It was something more like the feeling of standing at the edge of something very high and looking down and understanding, very suddenly, how far the fall was. She pressed harder against the wall and did not move. Below, Cole finally turned away from the observation deck and said something quiet to Danny. Danny let out a short, tired breath and sat down on a crate. Owen looked up at the ceiling and counted the rivets. Cole watched him do it and said nothing, because he had already done the same thing himself, and he had found something up there that was a great deal more interesting than the rivets. He had found an access panel. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked away, and his face did not change at all. IT started with the lights. 3 decks of the warship went dark at the same time, dropping from cold blue to the deep red of emergency lighting in the space of about 2 seconds. Somewhere in the walls, a low alarm began to sound, not the sharp, urgent kind that signaled a hull breach or an attack, but the slow, cycling kind that meant an internal systems fault. Confused voices filled the corridors. Boots hit metal floors. Guard rotations broke apart as soldiers tried to figure out where they were supposed to be. It was, from the outside, a complete accident. Owen Paz had not had a weapon during the arena demonstration. What he had was eyes and a very good memory and the habit, formed over years of working in hostile environments, of memorizing every access panel he passed. On the walk back from the arena to the holding cells, he had passed 7. He had looked at each one for exactly as long as it took to understand what it controlled. He did not ask questions. He did not point. He just looked and remembered, the way he always did, quietly and without drama. Back in his cell, He had taken 3 hours to work the edge of his boot sole into a thin enough point to trip the locking mechanism on the access panel that had been, by some small oversight, installed on the inside wall of the prisoner corridor rather than the outside. It was the kind of mistake that happened when a ship was built in sections by different crews who did not always talk to each other. Owen had noticed it on his first day. He had not said anything about it then. When the lights dropped, Cole was already at the cell door. Danny looked at him and said, in a flat voice, that she hoped he had a plan and that the plan involved getting off the ship and going home, because she had not slept properly in 3 weeks and she was tired and her back hurt. Cole said the plan did not currently involve getting off the ship. Danny stared at him. Cole said they needed to go deeper in. There was a short pause. Then Danny said that she had followed him into a burning building once and a collapsing tunnel once and a firefight with 7 hostiles and only 1 functioning weapon, and that each time she had thought he had lost his mind and each time he had been right, so she was going to stop arguing and start moving and she would trust the process, but she wanted it noted that she thought this was insane. Owen pulled the corridor access panel open from the outside. Cole and Danny stepped out. The other 3 prisoners pressed themselves against the back wall of their cells, too afraid to move, and Cole told them quietly to stay, to be still, to not make noise, and that someone would come back for them. He said it the way he said everything, like it was simply a fact, already decided. They moved through the red-lit corridors at a pace that was fast without being a run. Cole had been listening to this ship for 3 weeks. He had learned its rhythms the way a person learns the sounds of a house they live in, the hum of the engine room 2 decks below, the change in air pressure near the ventilation junctions, the particular echo of the upper decks where the walls were thinner. He had been building a map in his head every single day and now he was walking it from memory. Danny stayed close and kept her eyes on their rear. Owen moved slightly ahead and to the right, staying near the walls, watching corners before they turned them. They were looking for something specific. Cole had noticed it on the first day, a shift in the guard pattern near the 6th corridor on Deck 3, a cluster of HFY soldiers who answered to a different radio frequency than the main security channel. Small thing. Easy to miss. The kind of detail that only mattered if you were already looking for everything, which Cole always was. He had filed it away and kept watching, and over 3 weeks he had built a picture that was clear enough to act on. There was a faction on this ship that did not fully belong to the Emperor. Their loyalty ran somewhere else. Cole did not know exactly where yet, but he knew enough. He knew which corridors they used. He knew their patrol times. And he knew that the one place in the ship where their pattern was different, tighter, more careful, more alert, was the corridor that led to the Imperial family's private quarters. He was still thinking about this, moving quietly through a junction near the lower stairwell, when he heard the sound. It was not a loud sound. It was actually a very quiet sound, which was almost worse, a short, sharp intake of breath, followed by silence, the kind of silence that happens when someone understands they are in a bad situation and has decided the best response is to make no noise at all. Cole stopped. He held up one hand. Owen and Danny stopped behind him. Cole turned the corner slowly. The corridor ahead was narrow and lit red. HFY soldiers stood in a loose formation near the far wall, and between them and the wall, backed into the corner with her hands at her sides and her gold eyes moving very quickly between each soldier, was Princess Sevalar. Her personal guards were nowhere. Cole had not been surprised by this. Disappearing personal guards were exactly what you would expect from a faction that had been planning something. Sevalar's eyes found Cole in the dimness of the corridor. Something moved across her face, not relief exactly, because relief would have required her to believe that a human prisoner appearing in a restricted corridor during a system's failure was going to help her, and that was not a logical thing to believe. And yet, Cole walked forward. He did not walk fast. He walked at the same steady, unhurried pace he always used, like a man who had already accounted for every possible outcome and found none of them particularly worrying. He did not reach for a weapon because he did not have one. He just walked. The 4 soldiers turned toward him. Cole stopped about 3 meters away from them and looked at each one in turn. He did not say anything immediately. He just looked, very calm, very steady, and in the red light his eyes were very dark and completely still. Then he said something. Quietly. In HFY. Nobody heard the exact words except the soldiers. Danny, standing behind him, caught one word that she had learned from the ventilation conversations over the past few weeks, a word that meant something close to the concept of a record being kept, of things being remembered, of names being attached to actions. All 4 soldiers took a step backward. It was not a large step. It was not dramatic. But it was a step, and it was backward, and it was all four of them at the same time.
Sevala starat Austria cole.
Cole turned to her and said one word in her language. It meant move. She moved. She grabbed his arm without thinking about it, which she would wonder about later, and they ran. Danny and Owen fell in behind them. The soldiers did not follow, not immediately, and in the time it took them to decide what to do, the four of them were already gone, up a side stairwell and into a maintenance corridor that Cole had memorized 6 days ago. They ran for a long time. Sevala was faster than she looked. When they finally stopped, pressed against the warm metal wall of a ventilation junction on the 5th deck, Sevala realized she was still holding Cole's arm. She let go. She straightened. She looked at him with all the composure she could gather, which was somewhat less than usual. Cole looked back at her. Same calm. Same patience. Same dark, steady eyes. She thought about asking how he had known where she was. She thought about asking what he had said to those soldiers. She thought about asking a great many things. What she said, in the end, was that she had not needed rescuing. Cole said nothing. She said it again, more firmly. Cole said, very simply, that he knew. She did not have an answer to that. She looked away down the dark corridor and breathed slowly and told herself that her heart was beating fast because of the running. She was fairly sure that was most of it.B by the time the lights came back on. The warship was no longer in chaos. It was in something quieter and more dangerous than chaos. It was in the kind of stillness that settles over a place after something has gone very wrong and everyone is still working out exactly how wrong. Emperor Drathon stood in the command chamber with his hands behind his back and said nothing for a long time. His gold eyes moved slowly across the room, landing on each officer in turn, and none of them could hold his gaze. The system's failure had been traced to an access panel in the prisoner corridor. The prisoners, 3 of them, were gone from their cells. His daughter was not in her quarters. 4 soldiers from his personal security division had been found standing in a corridor on deck 3, and they were not talking. Orith stood at the far wall and watched the Emperor carefully. He had been watching him for 30 years, through battles and negotiations and political shifts that had reshaped the Empire 3 times over. He knew the Emperor's silences. This one was not the silence of anger. It was the silence of a man who had realized something and was still deciding what to do with it. It took 4 hours to find them. By then, Sevala had already explained the faction to Cole in as much detail as she knew, and Cole had explained several things back to her that she had not known, including the name of the soldier who ran communications for that faction, which he had worked out from voice patterns in the ventilation conversations he had been listening to for 3 weeks. Sevala had stared at him when he said the name. Then she had closed her eyes for a moment and said that this was the kind of information her father's intelligence service had been looking for 6 months. Cole said he had figured it out in about 2 weeks. Sevala said that she was not sure if that was impressive or frightening. Cole said it was probably both. They were brought to the throne room under heavy guard, all 4 of them, Cole, Danny, Owen, and Sevala herself, though the guards looked very uncomfortable walking beside the princess as though she were a prisoner, which she was sort of not, and sort of was, depending on how you looked at it. The chamber was large and formal and very cold, and every flat surface in it was carved with the names of the wars the Vethkai had won. There were a great many names. Drathon was waiting. He stood at the far end of the room on a raised platform, and he looked at his daughter first and then at the 3 humans, and his expression did not change at all, which was its own kind of statement. Behind him stood a dozen Imperial guards in formal armor. Beside him stood General Orith, still and watchful, and General Feln, who looked like he had not slept. The Emperor spoke. His voice was deep and even and completely without warmth. He said that the human had broken out of a secured cell, disrupted ship systems, moved through restricted corridors, and used knowledge of ship operations that no prisoner should possess. He said that the penalty for any one of these things was severe, and for all of them together, it was not something he needed to think about for very long. He told the guards to take Cole Harden to the execution floor. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Sevala stepped forward. She moved between Cole and the guards. She did not do it quickly or dramatically. She just stepped forward and stopped, and she faced her father, and she put her hands behind her back the way she had always seen him stand when he was about to say something he had thought through completely and was not going to be argued out of. Drathon looked at his daughter. His gold eyes were very still. He asked her, quietly, what she was doing. Sevala said she was making a case. He told her this was not a courtroom and she was not a lawyer, and she was also in a considerable amount of trouble herself for leaving her quarters and entering restricted sections of the ship without authorization. Sevalar said that was fair, and that she accepted that, and that it could be dealt with afterward. But first she wanted to speak. There was a long pause. Drathon nodded once. She did not start with Cole. That was the thing that surprised everyone in the room, including Cole, who had been watching her carefully. She did not make arguments about his value or his intelligence or what he had done in the corridor. She started with the faction. She laid it out plainly and calmly, the separate radio frequency, the shifting guard patterns, the soldier whose name Cole had given her, the 4 men who had been in that corridor on Deck 3 who were there not by coincidence but by instruction. She talked about who stood to benefit from the Emperor's daughter not returning from this voyage. She named the political rival back home. She connected the pieces in a way that was clean and clear and hard to argue with. The room was very quiet. Drathon's expression did not change, but his eyes had shifted slightly, and Orith, who had known him for 30 years, saw it. Then Sevalar said the part that mattered. She said that her father's intelligence service had been working on this problem for 6 months. She said that this information, the specific name, the specific pattern, the confirmation of the faction's activity on this ship, had been assembled and delivered by a human prisoner who had been in a cell with no access to communications, no intelligence briefings, and no resources beyond what he could see and hear through the walls. She said Cole Harden had done in 3 weeks, from inside a locked cell, what the Empire's best analysts had not managed in half a year. She said the coup attempt against the Imperial bloodline had been stopped tonight not by the Imperial Guard, not by military intelligence, not by any of the systems and structures the Empire trusted. It had been stopped because a human soldier who had every reason to do nothing had been paying attention. Drathon said nothing. He was looking at Cole now. Cole looked back at him. Same as always. Steady. Patient. No fear that anyone in the room could see. Drathon said, slowly, that his daughter was asking him to trust a conquered human warrior. He said this was not something the Empire did. He said the Vethkai did not take counsel from prisoners and did not owe gratitude to species that had been defeated. Sevalar was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she was not asking him to trust Cole. She understood that was too much to ask today. What she was asking him to consider was something different. She said she was asking him to think carefully about what it meant that she was standing in front of a human prisoner in the middle of the Imperial throne room telling the Emperor of the Vethkai Empire that this was not the man he should be executing right now. She said she was not afraid of very many things. She had grown up in the Empire. She had studied warfare and politics and conquest since she was small. She knew what danger looked like in most of its forms. She said she was afraid of Cole Harden. Not in the way one fears an enemy. Not in the way one fears pain. In the way one fears something that is several steps ahead of everyone in the room and has been there the entire time and has chosen, for its own reasons, to help instead of harm. She said that what frightened her was not what he had done. It was what he could have done, and hadn't. She turned and looked at Cole for a moment. He was already looking at her. His expression was the same as it always was. But there was something in it, very small, that had not been there before. She looked away before she could think too much about what it was. She faced her father. She said, "Not him, Dad." The throne room was absolutely silent. Drathon looked at his daughter for a long time. Then he looked at Cole. Then he looked down at the floor of the chamber and the long carved names of 400 years of victory. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud. He told Orith to have the 4 soldiers in the corridor taken to detention for questioning. He told Feln to begin a full internal review of faction activity on the ship. He told the guards to stand down. He did not say anything about Cole. But he did not say anything about the execution floor either. He turned and walked to the far end of the chamber and stood with his back to the room and his hands clasped behind him, looking at the stars through the forward viewport, and everyone in the room understood that the audience was over. Danny let out a breath so slowly it was almost silent. Owen, very quietly, said that was the most frightening thing he had ever seen, and he had once been pinned down for 6 hours by a hostile force with 1 magazine and a broken scope. Cole didn't say anything. He looked at the back of the Emperor for a moment. Then he looked at Sevalar. She was already looking somewhere else, very carefully, with her chin up and her hands perfectly still. Cole almost smiled. It was a very small thing. Nobody saw it except Danny, who filed it away with the long list of things she chose not to comment on. They were led out of the throne room and into whatever came next. The arrangement had no official name. The Vethkai legal code, which had been written and revised over 4 centuries and covered everything from the rules of planetary annexation to the proper forms of address for 17 different ranks of nobility, had no category for what Cole, Danny, and Owen now were. They were not prisoners. The cells on deck 2 sat empty and the iron doors stood open. They were not free. They had no ship, no communication access, and no way off the warship that didn't involve asking permission. They were not guests, exactly, though their quarters were better now and the food had improved. Danny said they were consultants. Owen said they were hostages with a slightly nicer room. Cole said nothing, which was typical, and which Danny had long ago decided meant he already knew exactly what they were and had simply decided to wait and see if everyone else caught up. The days after the throne room were busy in the way that large political events tend to make everything busy. The 4 soldiers from the corridor were questioned. They talked. More names came out. Those names led to other names. Orith moved through the process with the steady, careful efficiency of a man who had been waiting for an excuse to clean house and was not going to waste it. By the end of the first week, 11 members of the rogue faction had been identified, removed from their posts, and placed under guard pending formal proceedings back home. The intelligence service, which had been working on the same problem for 6 months, was asked to explain why a human prisoner in a locked cell had beaten them to the answer in 3 weeks. The report they submitted in response was long. The summary, however, was short. It said, essentially, that Cole Harden had done something that Vethkai intelligence analysts were not formally trained to do. He had listened to everything, assumed nothing, and made no decisions about what was important before he had all the information. He had no framework for what Vethkai internal politics should look like, so he had not filtered anything out. He had just watched and heard and remembered, and when the picture was full enough, he had seen it clearly. One of the senior analysts added a personal note at the bottom of the report. It said that the humans, as a species, seemed to have a particular relationship with being underestimated, and that the Empire might want to think carefully about continuing to rely on that. The note was flagged and sent to the Emperor. Drathon read it and put it down and picked up his morning briefing, which was how he dealt with things he did not yet know what to do with. Cole and Owen were given access to the ship's library by Sevalar, who had made this happen through a sequence of carefully worded requests that were technically within her existing permissions and had nothing technically unusual about them. The library contained military history, political records, species catalogues, diplomatic transcripts going back 200 years, and a complete linguistic database for 43 languages currently spoken within the Empire. Owen found a section on navigation and worked through it slowly. Cole read political history and took no notes because he did not need to. In the medical wing, Danny had found things to do. The ship's medical staff had initially been suspicious and then professionally curious, and then, after she correctly identified a dosage error in a post-surgical treatment that their own staff had missed, quietly respectful. She worked. They let her work. It was an arrangement that developed without anyone formally agreeing to it, the way most arrangements that actually function tend to develop. Sevalar began leaving books outside Cole's door. This started with a Vethkai text on imperial political structure, because she had thought about the analyst's note and decided it was both accurate and alarming, and that if Cole was going to be on this ship, then he should understand the context he was operating in. The next morning, she found it outside her door with notes in the margins. The notes were in her language, which he had apparently been learning from the ventilation conversations and had gotten quite good at. They were precise and they were occasionally very dry, and once or twice they were funny in a way that surprised her so much she had to sit down. She left another book. He left it back. The margins filled up. She told herself this was purely practical. Information exchange. Nothing more than that. She told herself this several times, with decreasing conviction. Word traveled, the way word always travels on a ship, in fragments and half-sentences and careful looks between people who know things they haven't been told to know. What Cole, Danny, and Owen had done moved through the crew in pieces. The arena demonstration. The system's failure. The corridor on Deck 3. The throne room. Each piece alone was interesting. Together they formed a picture that the crew of the warship found uncomfortable to look at directly, the way you find it uncomfortable to look directly at something that is much larger than you expected. The crew did not talk about it openly. They talked about it the way Vethkai talked about things that did not fit neatly into their understanding of the world, in low voices, in orphars, in the particular tone people use when they are trying to sound dismissive and not quite managing it. They said the humans were strange. They said the humans were lucky. They said it was a coincidence, some of it, surely. They gave Cole a wider path in corridors without discussing among themselves why they were doing this. It just happened. When Sevalar's arrangement with Cole and the books became generally known, which it did, because things on ships always do, nobody said anything to her directly. But the senior staff looked at it the way they had looked at everything involving the humans since the arena, with that same careful, slightly uneasy attention. General Orith, who noticed everything and commented on very little, did not comment on this either. But he had taken to walking past the library at odd hours and noting, without expression, what was being read. He wrote a personal report. It was addressed only to the Emperor. It said that in his professional opinion, the 3 humans currently aboard the warship were the most situationally aware individuals he had encountered in a military context in 30 years of service. He said this was not a comfortable assessment, but it was an honest one. He said that the Empire might benefit from treating the situation with corresponding seriousness. He sent it and did not follow up on it, which was the way he handled things he was confident in. The weeks passed. The warship moved through its route. The political machinery back home turned slowly, and the rival who had sent his faction aboard was being quietly, comprehensively dismantled, the way things were dismantled in the Empire, without drama, without public announcement, without any particular hurry. Then the transmission came. It was picked up by the ship's long-range communications array on a standard frequency, flagged immediately by the monitoring team, delivered to Orith within minutes and to the Emperor within an hour. It had originated from a deep-range relay station near the outer edge of human-controlled space. It was addressed, in a precise and formal tone, to any Vethkai vessel currently operating in or near the outer territories. It asked, with great politeness and very careful phrasing, about the current status and location of 3 members of the United Earth Defense Corps. It gave names. Cole Harden,
Danny Ruiz, Oben Paz.
It said that their last known coordinates placed them in proximity to the Vethkai vessel during the initial engagement. It said that the United Earth Defense Corps would appreciate any information the Vethkai Empire might have regarding their people. It said this with the particular courtesy of a message that meant something else entirely underneath, the way a knock on a door can be polite and still very firm. Emperor Drathon read the transmission twice. He set it down on the table in front of him and looked at it for a while. Then he stood and walked to the forward viewport and looked out at the stars, as he often did when he had something he needed to think through without interruption. 3 weeks ago, he had looked at these stars and thought of them the way he always had, as the space between the parts of the Empire and the parts that would one day be the Empire, as distance to be crossed and territory to be added. The calculation had always been simple. The Vethkai were strong. Others were less strong. That was the history of the galaxy. He thought about Cole Harden counting rivets in a cell. He thought about 3 humans in an arena that was designed to humiliate them. He thought about his daughter standing in front of him in the throne room with her hands behind her back and her chin up and saying, "Not him, Dad," as if she were completely certain, as if there was no version of events in which she was wrong. He thought about what kind of species produces a man like that. And then he thought, for the first time, about how many more there might be. He turned from the viewport. He told his communications officer to open a formal diplomatic channel. He said that they should begin talks with Earth. He said it quietly, and he only said it once, because he was the Emperor and he did not repeat himself, but there was something in his voice, not fear, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that sounded like a man who had stood at the edge of something very high and looked down and understood, very suddenly, how far the fall was. Down in the library, Cole Harden was reading about the history of the Vethkai Empire's first contact protocols, and making notes in the margins, and waiting. He had been waiting for this since day one. He had known it was coming. He always did.